Hello and welcome to Note Doctors. My name is Paul.
My name is Jen.
My name is Ben.
And we are your hosts. We are all university music theory instructors who are passionate about music theory and music theory instruction. In this podcast, we will be talking about all things theory with some of the best music theory teachers in the country. If you want to know more about music theory and the most effective and innovative ways to teach it, this is the podcast for you. Hello and welcome back to Note Doctors, the music theory and pedagogy podcast. So today we have a very special guest, Dr. Phil Ewell. We've wanted to have him on the show for some time, so we're really pleased to finally have him on the show to talk about so many interesting things. You're really going to enjoy this conversation. A couple notes about the episode. We had some technical issues getting Jenn into the conversation. It was during her fall break when we recorded this, and so she was having all sorts of issues. So unfortunately, she is not heard on this episode. Don't worry, she has not been fired. She will be back, but she unfortunately did not make this conversation. And one other thing, our connection kind of got severed at the very end, and so when Phil was talking about ways to be found on the internet, we don't have that bit of the interview. So I'll just let you know if you are interested in learning more about Phil Ewell. He has a great website, philipewell.com, where you can see about his research, his teaching, and his presentations. You can also find him at philipawell@gmail.com and to reach out to him. And so before we get into the conversation, though, Ben, I think you have the bio pulled up. We can learn more about Dr. Ewell.
Sure, happy to do it. Philip Ewell is a professor of music theory at Hunter College, CUNY. His specialties include race studies in music, Russian opera, modal theory and history, 20th century music theory, and rap and hip-hop. He is the author of On Music Theory and Making Music More Welcoming for Everyone, which appeared with the University of Michigan Press in 2023. That was also part of our book review. And he is co-authoring a music theory textbook titled The Engaged Musician, Theory and Analysis for the 21st Century. And he is the series editor for Oxford University Press's Theorizing African American Music. Thanks for joining us, Phil. It was a pleasure.
We know that the way that people were conceiving of this music in our educational institutions up to, well, certainly up to 10 years ago, frankly, really up until 5 or 6, 7 years ago, was just unsustainable. I mean, it was like a very short list of composers, all of whom were not from the United States of America, put way up on a hallowed hilltop, and essentially we told our students, this is all you need to know. And that's just silly. It's not just silly, it's a dereliction of duty as educators, because we're not serving our students properly. There are no jobs. We're telling them that this is it, and you're like, well, if that's it, then there should be jobs, right, at the end of the road for these students. There are none. So you're clearly not helping your students if you're clinging to that mid to late 20th century mindset that there really were only 15 to 20 truly great composers, and they were all white men from Europe, right?
So Phil, we are so happy to have you on the podcast after a long time of wanting to have you on, and I'm glad our schedules and everything finally worked, and we're able to have you on to talk about all things music. We love to start off our conversations just asking our guests a little bit about how they got into music theory. Was it a music teacher from when they were a child, or was it perhaps a young love of tweed jackets that really set you on the course for music theory, or maybe it was something else?
Well, thanks for the invitation. It's great to be with you all. I'm a fan of Note Doctors, and what got me into music theory? The short answer is Carl Schachter, actually, because
I did not see that one coming.
Yeah, to get me into music theory was Carl Schachter. I had gone to Queens College for a master's in cello performance, and I took 2 classes with Carl, and he advised my master's thesis on the Brahms F major cello sonata. And he was just having so much fun in front of the music theory classroom. And I'm like, wow, this is really, really great, actually. And so I just he planted the seed in the back of my head. But nevertheless, after that, I still was very much cello, 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 cello. And I thought I might just, do the cello route. But ultimately, I did come back to music theory. And yeah, it was Carl Schachter who first planted that seed in my brain.
That's cool. That's cool to think about, those students that we have in our own theory classes, that that just that little seed that never know what's going to come in the future.
That's right. And then of course the countervailing force in your brain is like, don't do it.
We've all heard it.
Maybe if you actually said that to Carl, he would have been like, yeah, don't do it.
Yeah. No, I imagine he would have been
money.
like, I'm sure he would have been like, go for it. I mean, he was a really vibrant teacher. And yeah, it was a pleasure to be in his classes.
That's fantastic. And so we're going to chat with you about a number of things, but we're first going to start off with a topic that you actually suggested. And so you have an idea to talk with us about, let me get this right, string pedagogy in St. Petersburg, Russia. And so I want to tell you this is a theory pedagogy podcast, Phil, so I'm not sure how this is going to work, but we can start with that.
Yeah, okay, that's great. Well, yeah, so let's make it a little bit of string pedagogy for a moment. I started playing the cello when I was 9 in Northern Illinois, and we had a really great music department at Northern Illinois University. My dad was a math professor there. But the Vermeer Quartet was in residence at NIU, and so we heard really great performances by one of the premier American string quartets, and I studied with the cellist Mark Johnson for a while, and when I went to so the reason the way that I ended up going to Russia were essentially, it was two reasons, I would say. I fell in love with Russian music as an undergrad. I went to Stanford University. And I was studying Russian, so that's number two, studying Russian. But I was studying Russian really because my dad was basically a communist, a black communist, right? There were probably tens of thousands of those in the 20th century. Paul Robeson, Shirley Graham Du Bois would probably be the most famous. We all know them. For the listeners, there's a great book by Cedric Robinson called Black Marxism. Came out in the 1990s, I think. That's probably the best place to go if you want to read about those Americans who were communists. I, by the way, am not a communist. I think it's kind of a silly way to run a country, but that's a different. I mean, I actually was in Leningrad, USSR in 1991 for the first time, and I could see. I'm just like, there's no food. What's going on? What happened here, folks? So you can kind of I saw firsthand how it kind of impoverished a very large part of the world. That form of communism did. But at any rate, my dad talking about this, Shangri-La, Soviet Union, he was totally wrong about that. But it still, nevertheless, put kind of put the thought in my head that maybe that would be interesting. But it was really the music that I was playing. So at Stanford, we did the Tchaikovsky Serenade for Strings, for example. We did Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, the Leningrad. I played the Shostakovich Cello Sonata. I played the Tchaikovsky Piano Trio, Prokofiev Cello Sonata. I mean, it was just, it kept coming back to Russian music. It was so amazing, right? The rep was and is fascinating. And then, so I was focusing more and more on cello, playing Russian music on my cello. I did go to Queens College, as I said, to get a master's in cello performance, and that's when I took classes with Carl Schachter. But after my master's, I really wanted to go to Russia to study cello, if possible. So the story there is the Leningrad Philharmonic was playing at Carnegie Hall. This would have been about 1990. And I was studying the language. And I went backstage. I found out that if I wanted to study cello in Russia, in St. Petersburg, I would need to meet and play for the principal cellist. And his name was Anatoly Nikitin. And a very famous cellist. He studied with Rostropovich. And so I, went back with my really awful Russian after the Leningrad Philharmonic one evening at Carnegie Hall, backstage, and I found one of the cellists, Sergei Slavachevsky, who was an assistant of his. I actually studied with him too for a while. And in my broken Russian, I was like, "Cello, study me, Russia, possible?" I'm being generous. That's it was probably worse than that.
This is
in
before
Rush.
like the little earpiece thing that now translates.
That translates
the
exactly
glasses or
real
whatever.
time, and also before anybody in Russia ever studied any English at all. So the orchestra, nobody really spoke any English. Now a lot of Russians, in fact, know some English. But he understood. He got Anatoly Nikitin. He's just like, "Okay, you come for me tomorrow at the Days Inn in Manhattan. I don't think it's there anymore. I think 59th Street or something. And you come play for me." And I went and I played the prelude to the Sixth Cello Suite. And Anatoly Nikitin said, "Okay, я согласен." And I'm like, "Okay, great. What the hell does that mean?" And what it means is I agree to take you as a student.
Nice.
And it was very strange. I literally got a visa for the Soviet Union. There were telegrams going back and forth in terms of finding out how I could do this. It was not easy, but I did ultimately go to St. Petersburg, and I stayed for quite a bit longer than I thought. Ultimately, 2.5, 3 years, 91 to 94. And I arrived in Leningrad, USSR. Ultimately, I left St. Petersburg, Russia. I like to say that I had nothing to do with those changes. That was purely coincidental. It was not me. And it really was an absolutely, utterly amazing time of my life, actually. So it changed a lot of things for me in very positive ways.
Yeah, that's incredible. That's amazing.
Yeah.
And so you're kind of. And so what has kind of brought you back to that now, kind of at this point in your career, kind of thinking about it?
Well, I think just generally as a music theorist, ultimately I did pivot to music theory away from cello, although I still can play cello. I don't play as well as I did in my 20s and 30s. But I did ultimately become a Russianist in music theory, right? That's where I have by far and away most of my publications, Rimsky-Korsakov, Tchaikovsky, and then the Russian music theorists like Boleslav Yavorsky or Igor Spasobin. Yuri Holopov is a big name who I was able to study with him, actually. Yuri Holopov died in 2003, but for a year in 99 to 2000, I met with him once a week, actually, and as I was finishing my dissertation, this was at Yale University already. So Russia's really played kind of an outsized, it's had an outsized influence on me. I am a fluent Russian speaker. I did marry a Russian in 2022. And she's in Brooklyn now with our soon-to-be 16-year-old son. Hard to believe that. But yeah, it's been a very big part of my life, and it's been sad watching Russia kind of come off the rails over these last few years. I've not been back because there was a time I don't think I could have gotten a visa. I think I probably could get a visa now. I'm trying to do a little bit of research along those lines, but I still probably wouldn't go back at this point. It's a little too precarious. But studying cello, of course, in the 90s was absolutely amazing. If you want to talk about that at all at St. Petersburg in the early 90s.
Well, I think, some of us, I'm just going to give a little shout out to, we've had a listener from Georgia, the country, and he reached out to us actually because he's studying music in Moscow, and because of the war with Ukraine, everything went to online. And so somehow he found our podcast and it was helping him with his theory because he was having to do all of his training online because of the war in Ukraine. And so I'd be curious to know, because I think many people have perhaps had teachers or had experiences with professional musicians who are from perhaps the Moscow Conservatory or St. Petersburg, and the experience is always of this kind of like sense of awe. I recall having a piano professor coming from, I think he was from the Moscow Conservatory, come to our tiny little Christian liberal arts college in the middle of nowhere, Ohio, when I was an undergrad, and we were so excited, and He got the best practice room with the best piano, and we were all excited to hear him practice. And I'm still struck by this image of him just sitting at the piano. He barely played a note in his practice times. He would look at the score, maybe play a few things on the piano, and that was his time. We thought he would be just, tearing the piano up during his practices, but it was quite the opposite. So I'd just be curious, as an American who went and studied over there, what was it like to be working with those kind of Russian professional musicians and professors?
Yeah, it was fascinating. It's a very, very intense work ethic. They practice their instruments from a very early age, many hours a day. The whole notion of in the United States, we have Saturday programs, and sometimes people, we all know of people who take piano lessons, violin lessons, clarinet lessons, flute lessons. And more often than not in the United States, it's just not that serious, right? It's kind of like, it's what you do. It kind of gives your child something to think about. It exposes them to some music, and maybe they'll take to it, right? Mm-hmm. But there's none of that in Russia. Which is both bad and good. I mean, it's good in the sense that they take it all very seriously, and there's none of this kind of middle of the road. It's bad because if you're not already kind of earmarked as a musician when you're like, 6 or 7, maybe 8, that's it. You won't have an option to go into music. If you're 12 years old and you want to go into music in Russia, they'll be like, well, what do you mean you're 12? Come on, give me a break. You can't do that. That's insane, right? So
that would have been me. That would have been me.
Yeah. I started when I was 9, so I would have barely made it. I think by the time you're 9 in Russia, if you're not in music, they're like, just don't even think about it. So it cuts both ways. But the seriousness is something to kind of behold. I remember when I first went to my cello teacher's apartment, very often the lessons are in somebody's apartment, and there are often many students milling about, like, oh, it's time for Sergei's lesson, and you change seats and you go over into the kitchen, you eat something, you have a cup of tea or whatever, and you listen. It's very open, which is good because it kind of just it gets you used to just playing in front of people. The whole idea of getting nervous is to a Russian is kind of they get rid of all of that very early. And if you can't handle your nerves by the time you're 12, you're like, okay, well, you can't play because you're nervous, so you're going to do something else. But you have 2 lessons a week, 2 hour-and-a-half lessons a week. You're expected to play. When you're going to the prep divisions, like my son, we spent a year in Moscow during my last sabbatical. Actually, that was 2017, 2018, and my son did the Moscow Conservatory prep program. But it wasn't just on Saturday. It was about 4 days a week. It was 2 lessons, and he was only like 8, right? But it was still 2 long hour and 15 lessons a week, and he did chorus and orff and dance and theory and history, and it was very, very intense. So it gives you an idea of the difference between how we treat music education early on. Now, in terms of like when you get there later as a conservatory age student, I was, already 22-ish, I think, when I was there. You're expected to just practice all the time, basically. And so, I did that. And the Russians, they have a certain way of playing. I don't know if you know that on the cello, a good Russian vibrato spans about a minor third. It's just, I remember my teacher when I went and I played the prelude to the 5th cello suite, C minor, and that's opens with this octave C, the open C string, and then C2 and C3, right? And and he just, so I played through the whole thing. It's the prelude and fugue. It's the only fugue that Bach wrote for solo cello. And he just kind of looked at me. He's like, okay, that's fine, Phil, but we don't do it like that over here. Like, okay. And then he grabbed my cello and he just started vibrating. And I mean, his finger was literally moving. It was moving up and down the fingerboard. And I'm just like, come on, man, you don't really play it like that. You're just kind of you're making a point about it. I think he actually was. I mean, they don't slide their finger on a note because, you need to have a core of a note, right? It can't be like a, oh. Nevertheless, I was just kind of like, it's a very heavy vibrato all the way. The Russians, they kind of square their hand up a little bit more, like in contrast to the French, who kind of angle it a little bit more. The fingers are pointed down toward the ground in France. In Russia, it's very much like a nine. I'm showing them here to the listener. I'm showing them. There's a visual. You just can't see it, listener.
You're missing it.
You're missing it. But my note doctor's colleagues can see it. But yeah, it's very much a 90-degree angle, and which allows for a very, very wide vibrato. That's the point I'm making. And yeah, and it was a fascinating time to be there. So they kind of put everything through that heavy, thick sound, a very, very Russian sound, right? That's a very wide vibrato in an intense bow close to the bridge sound. And at times we would say it's kind of inappropriate, right? But the intensity is always there. And that's kind of what I really appreciated. It's kind of like there's always a core to the sound. It's like never floaty and fluffy. And I see, of course, there's a time for floatiness and fluffiness, right?
Yeah.
So maybe there's a little less diversity in string playing in Russia. Back in the 90s, let's say. I mean, things have changed even since then. But it was great. I studied with Nikitin, who was a very famous cello pedagogue, and then I studied with two of his assistants. My favorite was Alexei Masarsky, who's a fabulous cellist. He's still in St. Petersburg, teaching at the conservatory. Sergei Slovachevsky, I think, also still in St. Petersburg. And they were young guns, and they just I think Masarsky was a Tchaikovsky laureate, Tchaikovsky competition. So the real deal. Yeah, it was a brilliant time to be there. It was a difficult time to live in the early 90s. There wasn't a lot of food. It was still kind of dark and dismal, but the people had a lot of hope, and it was very interesting to be there. Right now, it's a much darker time in Russia. People might not say that because of the difficulties in speaking openly and freely in Russia today. But they feel it, they know it. I know it too, and it's sad. So I hope for a brighter future in Russia and for everywhere, for that matter.
Yeah, absolutely.
Several points from that resonated with me, and let me just say, I've been trying to get across to my daughter this week. We did some basic piano. Usually we do it on Tuesdays. We got to the end of the lesson, and I said, Elise, I would love to hear you play some of the tunes tomorrow. And she says, well, Daddy, I have piano on Tuesdays. So I think you're exactly right that the pedagogical approach, from a young age, and I just thought, okay, I'll be lucky if she plays it one time in between, Tuesday to Tuesday. I'll be lucky. And she's 5, by the way. So you're exactly right. I don't think she would last a day in Russia, at the instructional level and the rigor.
Yeah.
But, ultimately you do have, in terms of pedagogy, when I think of maybe my Theory 1, I have several international students, and I have several people that grew up in the United States, obviously. So, trying to think about the amount of rigor and where people have come from, it's impossible to think that everybody is coming from the same place. In that Theory 1, that's just a premise that you could never take for granted. You have to meet people where they are, and that is kind of a takeaway pedagogically, from that type of thing, is that you have people coming from varying amounts of rigor, varying amounts of private lessons type experience. Some people have quite a bit, as you say, coming into college, and some people have none at all. And that doesn't mean that we can't serve both of those people. We just have to serve them differently.
Yep, that's exactly right. Yeah, and that's the American. That's really one of the beauties of the United States, right? The fact that we do have such a wide range of abilities, and yet we're still willing to work with people like in music, right, who might not have this superstar ability. You just don't find that in Russia. But on the positive side of the Russian educational system, you say your daughter might go from Tuesday to Tuesday, but so for a 5, 6, or 7-year-old, certainly for like an 8 to 10-year-old in Russia, they're already in an environment whereby they're meeting all of their peers in groups and making music, simplistically, but together. So that kind of, gives a momentum, right? I always say to people, when people ask me here in New York City, for example, hey, what do I do? I want my daughter, or I want my son, whatever, to play an instrument. I mean, one of the first things I say is you have to find some kind of community, right? Some kind of, so that they can be hanging out with their friends. It's just like, oh, look at my embouchure on the bassoon here, right? Oh yeah, I did you carve that on your own mouthpiece there? Or, like a 10-year-old, no, I bought it. I'm still working with that. Like, okay, great, but there has to be some kind of camaraderie, because piano is harder because there are fewer opportunities, right? To you play in a string ensemble, you just need to fill out 10, 12 people, and you can throw some music on the stand. You can make some music, right? You can do that with piano, but it's harder. You need obviously some chamber music, and there has to be it's harder to get together generally. But in Russia, they take care of that. It's all part of the educational surroundings, the educational institutions they have there. It's just a lot harder to get into them if you want to from the outside, kind of coming from a non-music point of view. So in Russia, obviously, the students who are doing music, well, their parents tend to be musicians also, often professional musicians. And it's just a much narrower slice of society. And that's a bad thing, ultimately, in my opinion. I have a friend who's one of my dear friends, Charles Maines, is like NPR's main guy, the Moscow bureau guy for National Public Radio. He's a really good musician, a guitarist, but he often plays with Russian musicians, and that's one of his gripes almost about Russians. It's like, yeah, they're often really talented technically, but it's really hard for them to think outside the box, and to begin to cross genres. Like, okay, you're a great violinist, you play Tchaikovsky, right, and Bach and everything, but just kind of, can you just slide like a bluegrass? Just like, can you chomp, can you do a little percussion with the bow, chomping, right? And they're just like, oh God, no, and they kind of lose it. And you're like, so it's, so there are limitations like that as well.
Oh yeah. Yeah, there's a Stuart Copeland, so the drummer for the Police. He's a composer, and he's talking about writing for orchestra, for film, and then he's like, they can read anything you put in front of them. The string players can play, but he's like, but they cannot rock. They cannot rock, and so I think there's something to that. And so that's just fascinating. That's really fascinating. And so I think we want to keep this kind of international kind of vibe going on here with our kind of second piece that we want to talk with you about a little bit. And that's work by Kira Thurman. And she has done a number of quite a bit of research on Black musicians performing and kind of making a living over in Germany. So her book, we'll give her a little shout out here. So this is Kira Thurman, Singing Like Germans, Black Musicians in the Land of Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms. It was published in 2021 by Cornell University Press. And so, I mean, I have not read the book, but I've watched her speak on it about 3 times, because there's a lot of really good YouTube videos where she presents basically on the book, and it's fascinating. And I thought I'd maybe just start with this. This is a kind of a joke that she makes in the presentation, and I'm just curious your thoughts on this. So she says, if classical music is a universal language, then it has a very strong German accent. Is that true?
I remember that, yeah. Well, Kira's a friend, and I have read her book. It's a brilliant book. It has a German accent. And she's saying that tongue-in-cheek, obviously, because for so long over here in the United States, we have, put into our hierarchy certain composers, the vast majority of whom were German speakers, right? The only exceptions would be Chopin, for example. And then, of course, you get into the 20th century. Well, the Italians for opera in the 19th century, and then, folks like Bartók or Debussy in the 20th century. But nevertheless, because of our radically hierarchized way of thinking about music, and that's, of course, has to do with Heinrich Schenker. There's no question about that. We often do think about Germany as this, Shangri-La of music, when in fact it's just a place on planet Earth where some people did in fact write music, and that's perfectly fine. But to say that it's better is quite silly, and to say that it's universal, well, what Kira is saying there is, yeah, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is universal. Indonesian gamelan is not. Let's be honest, right? So music is most certainly not universal. What people who want to say it is universal are actually doing is they're speaking in a very hegemonic fashion. You can call it colonial if you like. They're talking about 5-line staff notation, which is Christian, Catholic, 100%. We all know that as historians of music and historians of music theory. That's fine, but let's call it what it is. That's what it is. So Kira's book has a lot to do with, yes, black people who went to Germany to study music, but really not just Germany. She does talk about other destinations as well, obviously Austria, but I think she mentions, France and Russia, for example. So, but to be clear, the first African American to travel to Europe as a musician would have been Francis Johnson. He was born in 1792. I consider him the first great American musician. Shout out to a former Hunter student, Tyler Diaz, who's now getting a PhD at Yale, who is a Francis Johnson scholar. He did an independent study with me here at Hunter, and I learned from Tyler much about these things. But ever since he, 1820s, I think, took a quintet, a wind quintet. He was a great bugle player. He was also a great violinist, Francis Johnson. Blacks have been going over to Europe. There are opportunities. So, Edmund Day, Shirley Graham Du Bois in the 20th century, Paul Robeson, who tried to kill himself in a Moscow hotel, actually, who was a communist, Paul Robeson, a great American. Shout out to Shanna Redmond, who wrote a great biography on Paul Robeson too. You might put that in your show notes. So I think thanks for bringing up Kira's book. I also kind of come a little bit like at the tail end of this legacy of blacks who went to Europe to study music. The one thing that I could say, and I know Kira would probably echo this. She's, I think, from Austria. I mean, German is her first language, if I'm not mistaken. I'm pretty sure about that. And she teaches at Michigan, University of Michigan. But the interesting thing about being in Russia for so many years, I spent 7 years total in Russia, is that, especially in the 90s, my Americanness absolutely trumped my blackness, right? I was first and foremost American. Black was way down the list. And that was just amazingly refreshing, I have to be honest. Sure, people could look at me and say, well, you're definitely not Russian. Oftentimes people would think I was an Arab from North Africa. Great, that's no problem with that. But oftentimes, especially back then, I had nappier hair and it was darker. And I'm, here you can see it. The listeners thankfully can't. But,
you still have a luxurious head of hair.
Oh yeah, luxurious, exactly. Hair in the singular there for sure. Yeah, I have a hair. But no, it was clear to Russians. Most often they would identify me as a person of African descent, which is great. But the minute it came out that I was American, that was like, oh wow, well that changes everything. Now that's good and bad. It's good. It was good to me. It was very refreshing to not be tossed into the quote-unquote black bucket, which was, it's always been denigrated in the history of the planet, frankly. Also bad in the sense that they were denigrating blackness, right? I mean, Russians are anti-black just like most of the world, right? Nevertheless, it was, my Americanness actually put me into a very rare category in the 90s. There were only 3 of us studying at the St. Petersburg Conservatory when I was there, 92 to 94 roughly. And I kind of connected with that legacy of African Americans who were leaving, especially like in Jim Crow racism, going back to the 19th century. The Fisk Jubilee Singers famously toured Europe kind of on a whim. They just needed some money. They went and they made a ton of money, and they're like, okay, that's it. We're going back every year. And Kira writes about that quite a bit, because that was a moment in the late 19th century when African Americans were like, wow, we can not only relieve ourselves from some of the lynching, the hardcore KKK style anti-black racism, but we can also make some money. And so you did see a lot of African American musicians make that trek across the Atlantic, in boats until late 20th century. But yeah, it's a fascinating phenomenon. It's unfortunate that the level of anti-blackness was so high in the history of our own country that blacks would want to do that. But it makes perfect sense, especially for someone who's gone over there, and especially for a black person who's honestly learned one of the languages over there. You can really, I can get very deep into Russian culture and society, which has been one of the greatest things in my life, for sure, bar none. I would say to any American listening who has not learned a foreign language, by all means, if you can, and it's not that easy, if you can, live abroad and learn another language outside of English. And it's just one of the best ways to appreciate your own country. That's one reason, and I'll just end with this point. A lot of people over the last several years, I've written a lot about race in music, right? And people immediately think, oh, you hate America, you hate white people, Phil. And people who actually know me just a little bit, they're like, well, that's just crazy. That's just not true at all. My mother was white, and she was like the coolest person ever to live. So there's that. But it's really important for me to underscore there's some really great things about the United States. It's really hard to see it today. Personally, I'm not a fan of what's happening in Washington today. But I'm still a person who in the 90s, I was like, oh, thank God I've got this blue passport so I can get out of this crazy roaring 90s in post-Soviet Russia. 2 plane flights and I'm back home, where it's, just calmer and more stable. Everything's kind of in upheaval right now. And in the United States, we have our own upheaval going on. But still, it's worth pointing out that I, as a black person who understands the history of anti-black racism in the United States very well at this point, I do consider myself a race scholar, am willing to acknowledge, in large part due to my 7 years abroad in Russia and my ability to speak the language, I acknowledge the beauty of the United States. It's a beautiful country in many ways, and I'm happy to be a citizen, to be part of it. Even despite the problems that we see today. So and also I understand that people are people. We in the United States don't have a monopoly on anti-black racism. That's a silly thing. I also understand that it's silly to blame anybody, including white people. That's just a silly thing to be blaming and say, feel guilty, white. But what are you kidding? What are you talking about? The definitions of who counted as white have just radically changed over the decades and centuries. So, if you want, it's a very rare race scholar who would actually want to blame white people. I don't know anybody who actually, that's a fiction of the right? Yeah. Like, oh, we're supposed to feel guilty. Like, hey man, if you feel guilty, that's on you. Don't blame me, because that's the last thing I'm thinking of. Actually, I'm thinking of, as I often tell my students, responsibility, accountability. That's what I keep coming back to. And that's across the board. I've kind of gotten off topic from Russian string pedagogy for sure, but if we are talking, okay. Yeah. Well, yeah, but we are talking now about like Kira's book and black folks going over to Europe to study. I think the vast majority of those people, in the legacy, they would say, yeah, no, this is quite accurate, right? And they themselves, I myself, am a black person, and I have a responsibility to address the racial horrors of the past in this country, the way that all Americans do. We should all think of ourselves as having some responsibility. We should all hold ourselves to account. That's just an adult way of looking at it, which is why the current administration runs away from that adult way of looking at it and just points fingers and tries to divide and conquer. It's really awful to see it happen, but We'll make it through. We've made
We
it through things like this in the past. We'll do it again.
The adults will take over eventually.
Yeah, I can't wait.
I think one thing we might you brought up how Black musicians like had little opportunity in classical music, and I thought that was one thing that she pointed out really compellingly. She kind of mentioned you could either have a middling career if you want to do classical music, like so maybe be able to teach, but you certainly wouldn't get any positions at any major university or
Right.
orchestras, things like that. You could
Right.
go to popular music, like kind of like a Miles Davis or something like that, but certainly not classical music, or go to Europe. And so I was thinking about, what was the outlook for classical musicians, Black classical musicians then? And I guess maybe we can close this conversation with the question of, what is your outlook on perhaps just classical musicians at this point? What's our outlook, with our art, with the people that we're churning out of our universities and things like that? What's our outlook for classical musicians?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's broad and it's hard to answer. I'm working on a new book now, and so I have lots of thoughts. Maybe I'll just try to give you two or three. We all know who are teaching music in our higher ed institutions that classical music is not the most popular music out there, right?
By definition.
Furthermore, we know that the way that people were conceiving of this music in our educational institutions certainly up to 10 years ago, frankly, really up until 5 or 6, 7 years ago, was just unsustainable. I mean, it was like a very short list of composers, all of whom were not from the United States of America, put way up on a hallowed hilltop, and essentially we told our students, this is all you need to know. And that's just silly. It's not just silly, it's a dereliction of duty as educators, because we're not serving our students properly. There are no jobs. We're telling them that this is it, and you're like, well, if that's it, then there should be jobs, right, at the end of the road for these students. There are none. Yeah. So you're clearly not helping your students if you're clinging to that mid to late 20th century mindset that there really were only 15 to 20 truly great composers, and they were all white men from Europe, right? So I think now that we're deep into like the rethinking stage of our music educational system, and the reason I'm bringing up that is because the question of what is classical music, it has a lot to do with how we conceive of it in our educational institutions and how we put it forth, right? Whether it's a small liberal arts college or all the way to a Juilliard School of Music, right? But in terms of the professional aspect of it, so let's leave the educational institutions. I'm a little bit heartened by many of the things I see. You see classical musicians kind of retraining themselves, re-educating themselves, playing, not just throwing a piece by Florence Price on a concert because it's a beautiful piece of music, but kind of like digging into the weeds, like Florence Price leads to Clarence Cameron White, which leads to Nathaniel Dett, which leads to Coleridge Taylor Perkinson, and all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, these are extremely talented classical musicians who've written some music that should have always been played. It's not worse, it's not lower, it's not less on a hierarchical scale. That's a really hard thing for a lot of classical musicians to actually stomach. The idea that a Black composer, let's just say Julia Perry, could be placed on the same level as Igor Stravinsky. They were writing music at the same time, and they absolutely can and should be placed on exactly the same level. His music, Stravinsky's, was not better than Julia Perry's or Undine Smith Moore's or George Walker's. I'm giving Black composers who composed music at the same time, right? Mm-hmm. It was not. And there's something about our, I'll just be blunt, our white patriarchal trained brains. It kind of blows a fuse. You're like, no, just no. You just can't do it. No. To which I say, well, your fuse is blown, so you should check your fuse box. You just blew a circuit, so I'm gonna let you go away, walk away, and think about it. But you're wrong if you think that one is hierarchically higher than the other. It's not, okay? And that retraining, that re-educating is in fact the key, in my opinion, to the survival of classical music in the 21st century. It's not just throwing a few pieces on a program to appease, to check a few boxes and virtue signal. It's actually retraining our brains. It's individuals looking in the mirror at themselves and saying, oh my gosh, that darn Phil Ewell, he actually made me think about something and realize that I actually have, to an extent, believed in some of the tenets of white supremacy and some of the tenets of patriarchy in how I think of music, how I interpret it, and how I teach it. They actually have applied to me. And it doesn't make you a bad person if you can acknowledge that. It actually makes you a good person, to be honest. Because you're taking accountability. You're showing some responsibility. It's okay. Hey, you know the reason why I can say that? Because I did it myself. I had to swallow that bitter pill where I said, my gosh, my own beliefs about music actually, to an extent, align with some of the tenets of white supremacy and patriarchy. It really pained me to come to that conclusion. But come to that conclusion I did, and the I'll end with this. The re-education that can affect is really, truly one of the most beautiful things that a mid-career, let's say, classical musician could possibly do. Believe me, it is just one of the most amazing. I've heard it many times come from people just like, I started thinking like that, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh my God, look at Margaret Bonds. What an amazing composer. Yeah, I know. Go and dial up Margaret Bonds, listener, and you'll immediately hear and see what I'm talking about. That's a great question, though. Thanks for that.
You just made it to the end of another episode of Note Doctors, the music theory and pedagogy podcast. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and review the podcast, and you can always reach us at notedoctorspodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or show ideas. Thanks for listening.